The ambassador fell silent, his eyes widening as the human leaned back in his chair with a grin. "So let me get this straight," the human said, his tone as casual as if discussing the weather. "You're upset because we turned your entire war into a game of chess?" The council chamber hummed with hushed whispers. Representatives of the galactic conquered some covered in scales, others with feathers, and a few too alien in form to describe exchanged uneasy glances. Chess was a simple game, a quaint human invention. Yet somehow, it had become the decisive factor in interstellar diplomacy, forcing one of the galaxy's most powerful military forces, the Varkath Dominion, to surrender without a single shot fired. Ambassador Korak of the Varkath bared his fangs in frustration. "You reduced a conflict spanning 5 systems into a child's game. My people will never recover from this disgrace." Commander Vale shrugged, his expression unreadable. "You could have refused, but you didn't. You thought beating us would be easy because we're just unpredictable primates from a so-called death world. How did that work out for you?" Korak growled low in his throat, his clawed hands curling into fists. His species was bred for war 7-foot-tall bipeds, armored with natural exoskeletons, their reflexes honed by centuries of battle. And yet, none of that had mattered when faced with what humans called strategy. Representative Orion of the Thalosians, a translucent aquatic species floating in a water-filled mobility tank, chimed in, his voice soft and melodic. "If I may ask, Commander, how exactly did your kind accomplish this? No offense, but the Varkath are not known for surrendering easily." Vale's grin widened. "That's the thing about humans, we don't fight fair. You assume brute force wins wars. We prefer outthinking our enemies, and when that's not enough, we cheat." Ambassador Renza's voice rose in disbelief. "You openly admit to cheating?" Vale waved a hand dismissively. "Not the way you're thinking. We just exploit every loophole, every assumption, and every ounce of arrogance you throw at us." The room fell silent. This wasn't new information. The Galactic Concord had long debated humanity's peculiar habits, why they thrived in environments deemed uninhabitable, why they functioned so effectively despite constant internal conflicts, why their technological advancements often defied logic. But none of those quirks explained how they had turned a simple board game into a tool of interstellar conquest. Sensing the tension, Vale leaned forward. "You see, our greatest weapon isn't strength, technology, or even adaptability. It's something no one really talks about because it sounds ridiculous." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "It's our imagination." Korak scoffed. "Imagination? You expect us to believe that your species' ability to fantasize about nonsense is a strength?" "You don't get it," Vale said, his tone serious now, his grin fading. "Imagination isn't just about dreaming. It's the ability to think beyond the immediate, to connect dots that others don't see, to find solutions no one expects. That's how we took your invincible fleet and boxed it into a game. It was never about chess, it was about seeing a way to win before you even knew the game had begun." Representative Orion tilted his head. "Is that why you call your tactics creative warfare?" "Exactly," Vale said. "While you were planning invasion routes and calculating firepower, we were figuring out how to win without ever firing a shot. A few psychological plays, a handful of symbolic moves, and suddenly your warlords were playing right into our hands. By the time they realized it, it was already over." Ambassador Korak stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow over the table. "This isn't strength, it's cowardice, deception, manipulation." Vale didn't flinch. "Call it what you want. At the end of the day, it works. And honestly, we'd rather win with words and ideas than turn another star system into a graveyard." The Varkath ambassador glared, but said nothing. The room remained tense, the weight of the revelation settling over the council members like a heavy cloud. Many had underestimated humanity, dismissing their oddities as weaknesses. But now, this quiet, unassuming weapon imagination was forcing them to rethink everything. Breaking the silence, Vale's tone softened. "Look, I get why this bothers you. Losing is never fun, especially not like this. But if it's any consolation, we don't start fights. We just make sure we end them on our terms." "On your terms," Korak repeated bitterly. "And what happens when your kind decides our terms don't matter anymore?" Vale met the ambassador's gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's the thing about humans. We only get dangerous when someone else makes the first move. The room filled with uneasy murmurs. Even those who had never faced humanity in conflict were beginning to understand why the rumor schaff true, half-exaggerated, always carried a kernel of fear. Humans weren't just survivors or innovators. They were thinkers who saw battlefields where others saw order. Representative Orion, ever the diplomat, raised a tentacle in a gesture of calm. Perhaps it is time we adjourn this meeting. There is much to consider. As the council began to disperse, Vale stood to leave, but he could feel Korak's gaze on him. It wasn't pure hatred. It was something closer to reluctant respect, weighed down by frustration. As the chamber doors slid shut behind him, Vale allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Let them think it over, because it wasn't just about what humanity had done. It was about what they might do next. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was keeping everyone guessing. The hallway outside the council chamber was quieter than Vale had expected. Normally, these corridors buzzed with activity representatives and their aides discussing politics, trade, and military affairs. But today, the air was thick with something else: unease. Vale walked at a steady pace, his boots clicking against the polished floor. Behind him, a small group of aides whispered among themselves, their words barely audible. He didn't need to hear them to know what they were discussing. Humans always became the topic of conversation after meetings like this. It wasn't every day an empire was brought to its knees by a game that required no weapons-only strategy. Turning a corner, Vale nearly collided with a tall, wiry figure clad in a dark gray uniform adorned with the insignia of the Zilari Syndicate. The Zilari were traitors first, diplomats second, and warriors only when absolutely necessary. Their representative, Keth, had a reputation for being unshakable, always composed, always calculating. Keth tilted his angular head, the metallic sheen of his skin catching the light. "Commander Vale," he said smoothly. An impressive performance in the chamber. Vale stopped, offering a faint smile. Wasn't meant to be a performance just stating facts. Of course. Keth's pale blue eyes gleamed. "Though I suspect not everyone in that room found your facts reassuring, especially not the Varkath." "They'll adapt," Vale said with a shrug. "Or they won't. Either way, it's out of my hands." Keth studied him for a moment longer than Vale liked. "You do realize, don't you, that the entire galaxy is watching? Humanity has already proven itself resourceful and, shall we say, unpredictable. But this chess incident, it will leave a mark." "Good," Vale said simply. "Maybe it'll make some of the more aggressive factions think twice before trying anything." Keth chuckled softly, the sound like distant wind chimes. "Perhaps, or perhaps it will make them prepare for the day your clever tricks no longer work." Vale met Keth's gaze, unblinking. "The thing about tricks, there's always another one. That's the real strength of imagination, it doesn't run out." Keth's smile remained, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps wariness. Without another word, the Zilari representative inclined his head and stepped aside, allowing Vale to continue on his way. As he approached the human delegation's quarters, Vale couldn't shake the feeling that Keth's words weren't just idle conversation. The Zilari were always working an angle, always testing the waters. If Keth was probing for information, it meant the stakes were higher than anyone had let on. The human quarters were tucked away in a quieter section of the council complex, separate from the grand halls and main meeting chambers. It wasn't an insult, exact more of a precaution. The other species appreciated humanity's contributions but weren't quite ready to welcome them into their neighborhoods. Inside the main briefing room, Vale found Dr. Marcus Trent hunched over a holographic display, his fingers darting through streams of complex data. Trent was a civilian strategist, a brilliant but often abrasive man whose mind never stopped analyzing. "Interesting meeting," Vale said, dropping into a chair opposite him. "Interesting is one word for it," Trent replied, not looking up. "You've got the Varkath reeling, the Tholotians quietly relieved, and the Xilari, well, who knows what they're thinking. Probably working on a way to exploit all of this." Vale nodded. "Keth cornered me in the hall. He's worried we're going to destabilize the balance of power." "Worried or pretending to be?" Trent asked. "The Zilari love a good narrative they can manipulate." Vale considered this. "Doesn't matter. What's the data say?" Trent gestured to the display, which now showed a rotating map of Varkath fleet movements overlaid with human psychological warfare strategies. "They're retreating faster than expected," Trent said. "Publicly, they're calling it a tactical withdrawal, but internal communications suggest their leadership is in chaos. They didn't just lose a war, they lost credibility." "Good," Vale said. "That'll keep them quiet for a while." "Maybe," Trent said cautiously. "Or it could make them desperate. You corner a predator, it tends to lash out." Before Vale could respond, the room's comm system chimed. A voice announced, "Commander Vale, secure message from Earth. Priority 1. Vale exchanged a glance with Trent before standing. "Keep running the projections. I'll handle this." In the adjoining communication room, Vale activated the secure terminal. The face of Admiral Blake, head of humanity's interstellar operations, appeared on the screen. His expression was as stone-faced as ever, his gray hair cropped short in strict military fashion. "Commander," Blake said. "Status?" "The situation's under control," Vale replied. "The Varkath are licking their wounds, and the Council is too busy debating to take real action." Blake's brow furrowed slightly. "And the Zalari?" "They're watching us closely," Vale said. "Keth is probing for weaknesses, but we're not giving him any." "Good," Blake said, "because we've got bigger problems." Vale straightened. "What kind of problems?" "Intel suggests a coalition of rogue factions might be forming. They're not happy about what happened with the Varkath." Vale's eyes narrowed. "Rogue factions?" Blake nodded. "Think of them as a loose alliance of opportunists. Individually, they're not a threat. Together, well, that's where things get tricky. We need you to keep an eye on the Council and make sure this doesn't escalate." Vale exhaled slowly. "Understood. Anything else?" Blake hesitated for a fraction of a second, then said, "Just remember, Commander Humanity's reputation is a double-edged sword. Use it wisely." The screen went dark. Vale stood there for a moment, considering the Admiral's words. Humanity had always thrived on walking the fine line between brilliance and chaos. The question now was whether they could maintain that balance or if someone would finally manage to push them off. As he stepped out of the communication room, his mind raced. A coalition of rogue factions forming was the last thing humanity needed. This wasn't just about protecting their own interest, it was about maintaining the fragile balance of power that had only recently begun to favor Earth. Back in the main room, Trent had pulled up a new data stream. A section of the galaxy was now highlighted in red. "I just intercepted something interesting," Trent said, not looking up. "There's chatter about a meeting between some of the more vocal anti-human factions. Location is unclear, but it's big enough to set off our alarms." Vale leaned over the display. "Who's involved?" "The usual suspects," Trent replied. "Some fringe Varkath warlords, a handful of Zalari separatists, and a few independent mercenary groups. Individually, none of them are a threat. But together, they could cause real damage," Vale finished. Trent nodded. "If we don't act first, we might not get another chance." Vale's expression hardened. "Then let's make sure they never get the chance to act at all." The battle wasn't over. It had just begun.